you like spelling?
Yes, you do.
I think we hear is the radio TV open there?
Upstairs.
Okay, we need to do.
You want me to have
close these doors here.
this one? I'll have to shut it down a little bit. It's not that close.
The date is July 6, 1995. We're with Kurt Forst. Interviewer Larry Herbst. Studio City, State of California, the United States of America. Language spoken, English.
My name's Larry Herbst. I'm here to interview Kurt Forst. We are in Los Angeles, California. What is the date? The date is July 6th, 1995.
My name is Kurt Forst. I was born on September 20th, 1919, in a small town in Germany called Kastellaun. It was not far from the city of Koblenz on the Rhine River. And I had 3 older brothers. The first one was born in 1913, and then my father was a soldier in World War I. And then just a few months after I was born, my mother tragically passed away. And my grandmother, on my father's side, she was the one that raised the 4 of us. Till my father got remarried, I think it was in 1922. And they had 3 more children, 1 half-brother and 2 half-sisters. The life in the small town was, compared to our standards today, rather simple. We belonged to a Jewish congregation. There were about 30 families in this town. They were, by and large, Orthodox. And we went to shul, we were bar mitzvahed, we laid tefillin, we did the whole bit. Till the time that we started growing up and had to find some kind of employment, some kind of work.
How large a temple?
The temple was a small synagogue. The men were downstairs, the ladies were upstairs, so it was Orthodox. And they observed all the holidays. And we looked forward to those holidays. It was a big thing to have Seder on Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot and Hanukkah and Purim. It was something to look forward to as children.
What was a typical Shabbat like?
A typical Shabbat started on Friday evening. We even had someone come in to turn on the lights and light the stove, and that was thing. We didn't ride in any kind of car or anything like that on a Shabbos. It was an Orthodox life. But as we grew up, we had to go to work, and slowly things began to change, especially after Hitler came to power in 1933. I graduated from the local grammar school that same year, and my older brothers all went to high school, but with the approach of the political situation changing, there was no more chance for us to attend high school, although one of my brothers was still there till it got so bad that he had to quit by, I think it was 1934 or 1935. They made it so miserable for him in high school that he had to quit.
Okay. Before we get into high school and things like that, I'd like to go back to your earliest memories, to when you were a very small boy. What are your earliest memories?
My earliest memories was when my father brought in his second wife, my stepmother, and he got all of us together in the living room and said, "Boys, I want you to meet your new mother. She'll be your mother from now on, and you respect her, and we'll all get along fine. And my grandmother was living with us at the time, and she lived with us in the house until she passed away in 1935. And things were, we all had our chores to do. It was a large family, and everybody got along fine. We had to help milk the cows, clean the barn, make hay in the summertime, and work in the fields. We were sort of half, my father was in the cattle business, half was business and half was farming. And we had our own vegetable garden, we had our own fruit trees, we had our own land where we grew potatoes and the whole thing, just like anybody else in town.
Did you have specific chores that you alone had to do?
Well, I think we all shared more or less in the chores around the house, and we were not pampered by any way, but we had our good times. You know, we had time to play and time to play soccer, and with the boys that we went to school with. We went to an integrated school. But there were only maybe the population of the Jewish people was probably about less than 5%. And the only religious training we got, we had a rabbi had a session every Thursday for 3 hours in the afternoon. That's where we got our religious training, besides what we were taught at home, especially by my grandmother. She was very, it was very important for her to know that we would get a religious education. So like I mentioned before, we all went through the bar mitzvah and the whole thing.
So the rabbi would teach in the school, or?
He come to the school, to the regular school, yes. And he was teach us religious training, you know, Jewish history and about the Torah and about the whole, you know, everything.
So he would take you out of all the Jewish kids aside?
Well, we had that afternoon off. We had the afternoon off because we were the Gentile population. They had this children. They had the first hour in the morning was religion in Germany. So they were separated with the Catholics and the Protestants. The Catholic had their school and the Protestants had theirs. We went to the Jewish people, students went to school with the Protestants. And they had the first hour in the morning was religion. And we were exempt from that. We didn't have to go the first hour. So we made it up on the 3 hours that we got on Thursday afternoon from the rabbi.
Now, how many children were in the whole school?
Well, there were each one of the Jewish families, they had quite a few children. Of course, my father had 3 more children with his second wife, so there were 7 of us. And there were some that had 2, 3, 5. You know, there's a lot of there were a lot of kids involved. There were up to 20 Jewish children in school all the time.
Out of a total population of how many?
The total population, the town had about 2,000 people. It was a small town.
Okay. So
But there were even smaller villages. This was a commercial type town. There were smaller villages all around. They consisted of anywhere from 200 to 1,000 population, and they used to come to this small town to do their marketing and do their shopping. There was a business town. Also, besides the business, there was farming, agriculture.
So it was the center of life for...
Yes, the center of life for the surrounding communities. And they had a cattle market, cattle and livestock market, I should say. There was not only cattle, there were other livestock. Every other Wednesday, and there was something else to look forward to. We used to have people come from all the other villages, and Jewish cattle dealers used to come from other towns, and they bring their cattle to buy and sell at this market. And they had one or two Jewish like boarding houses that were serving kosher food to these people, so they didn't have to bring their lunches or whatever. They would get a hot meal and a kosher meal.
Now, your father was in the cattle business?
My father was in the cattle business, so was my uncle. And my uncle was also the local shochet. And he used to, there was one or two butchers in town that used to have a kosher kill every week. And we used to buy the meat from them. And they were also had other, they were not strictly kosher, but they had a kosher section besides their other business. And so to facilitate the Jewish customers that they had, and worked out quite well. Or sometimes we used to slaughter a calf or a lamb on our own and had it in the wintertime.
Well, now, what was your father's name?
Jacob.
Okay. And how old was he when he had you?
Well, I mentioned, I think he was born in 1883. So by that time, by 1930, he was, 47 years old.
What kind of man was he?
He was a very easygoing man, bald-headed, but he would rather compromise than have a confrontation. And I think I have some of his temperament.
Can you give an example of circumstances where this was?
Well, when we had problems as children, amongst each other, he would always step in and be the mediator and set us on the right course. And after that, everybody made up and things were worked out pretty good. And he saw too that that it was very important, even then, to see that we would get a good education and would not have to follow in his footsteps, because that business was pretty rough. It was competitive. It was time-consuming. It was just a hard life. And he wanted something better for us. And when my older brother, he went to high school, when he graduated, he thought he would learn some kind of a trade, and he became a machinist, unlike many other Jewish people. But he went to a big city, Cologne, Germany, which everyone knows, and he worked in a large diesel factory. And he had his room and board at a Jewish, they call it a Lehrlingsheim, which is a home for apprentices. They had all kinds of Jewish apprentices. Some of them were in the butcher business, some tailors, some machinists, or very few machinists. But there were all kinds of apprentices that they had a home for them. So it was very inexpensive for his room and board. And he would turn out quite well. So when he graduated, when he went through after his apprenticeship, he stayed on there. He wanted to continue, but it got to a point where he was also kicked out because he was Jewish. So by 1937, with the help of some relatives here in America, he got his papers and he left. He left just a year before I did, in June 1937.
Okay. Now, you had three brothers older than you.
I had three.
Three. Okay. What were their names?
The oldest one was Ernest. The second one was Fritz, and the third one was Hans. Hans eventually went to Israel also in 1937. I think he left around Pesach, I remember. We were together in Luxembourg at the time. And he decided to go to Israel because he was involved in a organization. They were training to work on the land in Israel to be a member of a kibbutz. So there was, I think they call it hachshara. There was a preparation for training for Israel. So he left he was in Luxembourg for about 2 years, and he left in 1937.
Okay. How many years difference was there between?
We had steps almost 2 years apart, from the oldest to myself. From Ernie, the oldest one was born in 1913, then 1915, then 1917. I came along in 1919.
Okay. So there were the three of them, and then you had a new brother and 2 sisters.
Well, they didn't mention the second. Ernie worked in his machine shop and in the factory, and the second one, Fritz, he was also in the butcher business. He got his training in a town in the Saar Valley called Saar Louis. And after his training, and he stayed on there as a journeyman, so-called. And then in 1935, I think it was, they had this plebiscite in the Saar Valley, and they annexed to Germany. I don't know if you know your history about that. So it was very uncomfortable for the Jews to stay in the Saar. So a lot of them went to Luxembourg, a lot of them went to France and Switzerland, and my brother decided to go to Luxembourg.
Okay. Once again, trying to just go over your whole family. You have the three older brothers.
3 older brothers.
Yourself, and then you had
3, yes, 3.
A stepbrother.
A stepbrother and 2 sisters.
Okay. What were their names?
The stepbrother's name was Manfred, and the oldest girl was Bella, and the youngest one was Hannelore. Hannelore.
And how old were you when they were born?
Well, they were born to. Manfred was born in 1924. I think Bella was born in 1927, and Hannelore, I think, was 1929.
Was there a difference in the way the family?
No, but by that time, like in 1927, 28, my older brother already had left the house. He already went to work in, like I mentioned, in Cologne. And then a couple of years later, the second one left to work in the butcher business. And there were the 5 of us together, and my grandmother was still alive, and she helped with the chores around the house, and she was a good cook and make a lot of good Jewish dishes for Friday nights and for the Jewish holidays. And although she was very fond, as I remember, very fond of my real mother, she got along with my stepmother quite well.
So it was your father's mother?
Yeah. Okay. And my grandfather on my father's side, I just barely remember him because he died, I think it was 1923. I was just a little one.
What had he done?
He was also in the cattle business. And I remember he died shortly after had a big celebration. They had just celebrated their 50th anniversary. And I remember a big party in the house. And I imagine he died just shortly after that.
Were there other family members that you were close to? Aunts, uncles?
Well, the uncle that we had this one uncle that later on went to France, and he only had a son and a daughter, and they were a little bit older. He was the oldest of my father's brothers and sisters. And his son had already left. That I don't ever remember him being home because he was a little bit older, and he worked in Frankfurt in some kind of leather goods business. And his daughter was home, but we were probably closer to the others. They were closer to us in age anyway, to my aunt's 3 daughters. The oldest one left early, I think it was 1927, and she went to America. And the other 2 we grew up with them. They were a little older than I am, but we got together quite often on the holidays and so forth. And their father was killed in World War I. He was killed in France in the Battle of the Somme.
Okay, can you tell me all their names?
Yes, the oldest one was, we called her Bertel, but her name was Bertha. And the second one was Henny, and the youngest one was Edith. Edith was the same age as my oldest brother, so they were all a little older than we were. And Edith now lives in Chicago, and Henny still lives in Chicago. The older one has passed away.
And your aunt?
My aunt has passed away a long time ago. She went to my Aunt Frida. She was a tiny little woman, but she had a lot of spunk, and she was the war widow, and she had a pension from the German government, but when her relatives were visiting, I think it was in 1933 or 1934, and they saw the Nazi flag flying over the ruins that are in the town, and she says, "You have no business staying here. We'll get you your papers, and you come to America." And she left in 1935. She had a good going business at the time too. My uncle was a decorator and painter, and he was sort of an artist besides. And there were some remnants of his work in her house, which was elegant, murals and things. But like I said, he was killed in World War I.
Let me ask you this. Do you recall the first time that you ever saw a swastika?
Oh, that was probably as early as 1928, 29. But I don't remember any real animosity in this little town. There may have been marches and political upheavals in the larger cities, which we read in the newspapers. But in our little town, it was rather quiet. In fact, we knew who was an anti-Semite and who wasn't. And I would say that we got along with 90% of the people. We had no problem with them.
But the other 10%?
But the other 10%, we just avoided them, that's all. And they seemed to do the same to us.
In what ways was this expressed?
Well, sometimes you were called a dirty Jew when something happened, you know, that type of thing. And we always stood up for what we called our rights, and we defended our position. And up till the time that it was actually organized and supported by the state, up until that time we had no problems. After 1933, when the problems started, I started working in 1933. I went away to a small town near the city of Mainz, and which is not too far from Frankfurt. And I started working there, and there the Nazis were quite active, already in 1933. And I remember the first boycott of the Jewish stores in the first Saturday of April of 1933. And my aunt, the war widow, she was very upset. She closed her store, although two uniformed Nazis were in front of the store trying to keep people out from patronizing the store. And even the people in town were upset because they thought they should not have messed with her. Because she's, after all, she lost her husband fighting for the Kaiser. What do they want from her? No, she's a Jew, and she has to be. And these were not the ones that came in uniform to cause all the trouble. They were not local people. They were, we don't know where they came from, but they were in uniform, and they start stirring things up. And I left in 1933. In this little town in Ingelheim, there were quite a bit of problems. I remember the first Yom Kippur. We went to shul, and we come out of shul. It was Yom Kippur was on a Shabbos, I remember. And we came home, and my boss's wife, she was already home, and the Nazis came to the store looking for my boss. So she said, he's still in the synagogue, he's not home yet. So she asked me to run to the synagogue to tell him not to come home because they were waiting for him. This was 1933. And he was the type of guy, they can't keep me out of my house. So he came home, and when he saw what was going on, he was hiding up in the hayloft. And a couple of days later, the local police came to arrest him and called it for his own protection. They arrested him and incarcerated him in mines, and they thought that was the early days when they just first organized Dachau. And they thought they would send him to Dachau. But the local police, he had some influence with them, and they sent him home. And he was, and then I remember they were shooting in the store one night, and my father read about it in the papers, and he was very concerned that I was there. It was that, you better come home because everything is quiet here. You don't have to put up with this. So I said, no, if it doesn't get any worse, I can stick it out. And I did stick it out. But like I said, from 1933 to 1936, the business started. We had 4 people working there besides the boss and his son. And by 1936, I was the only one left besides the family. And I saw the handwriting on the wall. The business got worse, and the people were afraid to buy from a Jewish store. And some of them wanted to have their meat delivered at night so they wouldn't see us, this type of thing. And it got very uncomfortable. And so I made up my mind to look over the situation. I had his 2 brothers in Luxembourg, and my brother in Cologne. He came, and we went to Luxembourg to see how the situation was there. I got a passport and went to Luxembourg. So we went back, he came back, and I said, I told my boss then that I will, as soon as he can get someone else or he wouldn't need anybody else anymore, I would leave. He said, yeah, you can't leave us now. We depend on you and so forth. I said, how can you depend on me? He says, there's no business left. You got nothing to do. And they won't let you have any good cattle to slaughter anymore. You get all the junk that's left. You have no quality in the store anymore. It's the business is going down. You have to, sooner or later, be closing up. It's not going to come to that. They had hopes that it would go away, but it didn't go away. It just kept getting worse and worse.
What was the name of the business?
The name was Strauss. His name was Heinrich Strauss. He had a butcher shop, and he was very proud of his business. He worked up a good business. Like I said, he employed 4 or 5 people at one time, and for a small town in Germany, that was a nice business. They made a nice living at it.
Okay, so it was a very successful business that when you started working.
When I started working there, yes.
How big was the store?
Well, we were using up about 6 or 7 head of cattle a week, and also about half a dozen calves, sometimes lamb. We didn't handle any pork. And we were kosher up. When I started already, the first thing that Hitler started was he cut out he banned what they call a shechita. It was killing for kosher. So we had to stun the cattle before we could do the kosher killing. So it was a different thing, but they still call it kosher. It was and it wasn't. Because we had quite a few kosher, Jewish customers, so we kept it that way.
Now, the town that this was in?
Was Ingelheim, on the Rhine River, between the town of Bingen and Mainz. It was also a wine-growing region. You can buy Ingelheimer red wine, was very famous. I'm sure you can buy it in the local stores.
Okay, how big a town was it?
There was 2 combined towns. There was a Nieder and an Ober Ingelheim. There was an upper and a lower Ingelheim, which is, the 2 of them together probably had about 10,000 people.
And was there a good size Jewish population?
There was a good sized Jewish population, yes. They had the 2 towns together had 1 combined synagogue. They had a rabbi, and I would imagine they had at least 40 or 50 Jewish families. A lot of them were engaged in the cattle business, but a lot of them also in the wine business. And a lot of them had regular, merchants, local merchants, stores.
And you would attend synagogue there regularly, or?
I went to synagogue on Friday nights and also on Saturday. My boss let us go. He said, if you want to go, it's up to you. He didn't force us to go, but he was a religious man. He went to synagogue, and they kept all the holidays. And we continued our Jewish traditions. The only thing I cut out was I did not lay tefillin anymore. At first, when I first got there, I started, but it was too time-consuming. We had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to start working, and to get up any earlier than that to lay tefillin got a little bit rough for a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old I was at the time. So I just didn't do it anymore.
Where were you living at this time?
I lived with a family there. I had room and board there, besides getting a small amount of wages as an apprentice.
Jewish family?
A Jewish family, yes.
What was their name?
Strauss. I told you.
Oh,
yeah.
You were.
Yeah, we were living with the family in the house.
With the owner of the business?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did the environment of that town compare to where you were born?
I thought they were, like I said before, they had these so-called pogroms. They were shooting in the store and trying to arrest Jewish merchants, and the local people complained they were outside agitators, Nazi outside agitators, but I'm sure they had enough support locally in this town that the police closed their eyes, they didn't do a thing about it. And then when the police came at the time they arrested my boss, they called it protective custody for his own safety, you know. So that was all. They had nothing against him. He was a straightforward businessman, nothing underhanded, and we we had our people that were inspecting the meat, the government, and so-called they were local people, but they were hired by the government to inspect everything we were doing in the place, whether we were making sausage or killing cattle, everything was inspected. Everything in Germany in that particular field was very strict.
So you think the local population there was of a different...
I think they were a little different than the town where I came from. And they were probably more sympathetic to the Nazis, I don't know. But like I said, I was there 3.5 years, from June of 33 till January of 37, when I finally left. In the meantime, I went to school. Once a week they had to let us go to, while we were apprenticing, they had to let us go to so-called trade school in this town in Bingen. And we were, that was on Mondays. And at first there were several other Jewish youngsters in the school. I recall 3 of them besides myself. And we had no problem, an incident once in a while, but the administration of the school changed, and a big Nazi Gauleiter or whatever he was, he took over the administration of the school, and he started making trouble for us. So the teacher that we used to have, he called me in one day and says, look, if you can keep your nose clean and stay out of trouble and stick it out till you graduate, I would advise you to get out of Germany. He said, I can't see anything good happening here for the Jews or for us. He said, things don't look good. And the man knew what he's talking about. He says, the only reason I'm sticking it out, he says, I got 2 or 3 more years to go and I'll be pensioned off, and I hope I'll be stick it out to get my pension.
What kind of things was the administrator doing?
Well, any little thing that he didn't like, he says, you know what we're going to do with your kind. Like send you to a concentration camp or something. They were already established by 1935 and 1936. There was like Dachau was already well established then. And there was one near Frankfurt that there was a staging area for Dachau. And they would send, if they find something, they didn't have to find anything. They could just fabricate some story and arrest you. There was no, there was no safety involved anymore. You couldn't, you didn't know if and when it was going to happen. So I was fortunate to stick it out till this date in 1937, and I just took off.
Now, were you...
She'll get it upstairs, never mind. She has it upstairs.
Okay. Now, you were in your early teens at this time.
Yes.
How concerned were you at this? I mean, did these kinds of threats frighten you? Were you just...
You were scared. When I used to go shopping for some personal things or need a pair of shoes or a pair of pants, whatever, I used to try to go to the big cities where I got lost, where you couldn't be identified. You didn't have to, they didn't know you were Jewish. I mean, I didn't particularly look Jewish when I was young. And so I got lost in the big city, so to speak. And but the local people, they knew who you were, who you worked for. In a small town, everybody knew everybody else. You just have to hope for the best and stay out of trouble. And it wasn't easy at times.
Now, you had said before that 90% of the people were okay and supportive.
Yes. I rephrased that. Before 1933, in our town, I can't speak for any other place, because there were pockets of or areas in Germany that were anti-Semitic long before Hitler took over, where the Jews had a hard time even before then. And when Hitler took over, it got bad right away. Like one of my brothers went to work in a town where he got beat up a couple times, and he just took off. He left. Then he came to Luxembourg. That's the one that went to Israel. He just couldn't stand it. That was in a small town not far from Frankfurt. I think the town's name is Schlüchtern in Oberhessen. And it was very bad there. He got beat up a couple times because they knew he was Jewish and worked for a Jewish merchant. And he just couldn't take it. He had to take off. He went back home to Kastellaun and on to Luxembourg.
Now, did you ever have similar experiences?
I had threats, no physical. I had threats, but no physical experience.
Was it just a few people, or was it widespread?
It was widespread, but not just because the movement took on so fast that by 1935 this Hitlerjugend business was so strong, and they had a work camps they established for young people to work on the Autobahn and so forth. That they were prior to that they were unemployed, so when Hitler promised them Arbeit und Brot, work and bread, they were going for it. And I would say by the time, even during the time I left, and even later, that it got so strong and the propaganda was so bad that 90% of the German people turned the other way and went hook, line, and sinker for this Hitler business. That they was doing good for Germany. He was building Autobahn, he was building up the Wehrmacht, and everybody was employed. And I think they just didn't believe it or didn't give a damn what happened to the Jews. There were some that cared. Even my father wasn't taken away, as I understand, from this little town till 1942. He couldn't do any business. He had no way of making a livelihood. We had some property that he sold under duress for peanuts to be able to buy whatever he could, whatever they would let him buy. They wouldn't even sell anything to Jews anymore. We had a neighbor that had a butcher shop. It was back to back on our yard. He used to come at nights and bring him food so they wouldn't starve to death. And when my brother came in an American uniform to this town in 1945 as an American soldier, and the war wasn't over yet, early in 1945, this neighbor called him in. He wanted to say hello to him. Neighbor called him and said, "No, we can't come in, we can't fraternize with you." He says, "Look, when I call you to come into my house, I don't care what your officers say. You come on in." He goes, "I have some relics for you that your father left me to give to you, to give to anyone that would show up. If your father doesn't come back, you can have it. We hope." But they still had hopes for him to come back. And these people helped to sustain him till the day they left. So there were people that had a heart. They were not all, and the ones that tried to were afraid. They had to do it by night, or they would take them into camp. When we were there in 1989 for this project week, we had a woman coming to our meetings. She was from a neighboring village. Her son was a Protestant minister, preacher. And he was speaking out against the Nazis from the very first day they started. And they arrested him several times, put him in local jails. And then he wouldn't let up. They sent him to Buchenwald. He kept up his preaching in Buchenwald. In Buchenwald, besides having a lot of Jews incarcerated, they had a lot of political prisoners, ex-communists and political rivals that were incarcerated in Buchenwald. And they warned him, just look, these guys are going to kill you if you don't shut up. He says, I can't, as a preacher and as a human being, I just cannot be still over what's going on. And in 1938, they sent him home to his mother in a coffin. He was 38 years old. He had 6 children. And this old lady came to our meeting. She was 82 or 83 at the time. And and she wrote a book about it. That's what happened to her husband, who was a Protestant minister who spoke out against the Nazis from the very day it happened. So there were isolated cases like that. And you can see in Israel we had the opportunity to see it at the Yad Vashem, where they have, as you walk up to the memorial, they have trees planted in honor and the memory of people that did help the Jews all over Europe.
Were there other people that you knew who, I mean, did you have any other friends, friends of the family, or for that matter, did you know any Nazis?
Sure, I knew a lot of them. The people, boys that I went to school with, like I said, the 90% were friendly to us, and there may be 10% that we knew were anti-Semitic. Where they got it and what they had against us, I don't know. We didn't bother them, and but we went to school with them. We had fights with them in school. But later on, after I left and all that, you wouldn't want to pick fights anymore, even to protect yourself. For name calling didn't bother you that much anymore. It was a routine. It became routine. You wouldn't raise your fist like you did earlier.
Just be quiet.
Yeah.
And take it. Was there any particular close friends that turned on you, as it were? Yeah,
but of course I left early, so the youngsters I went to school with, I went to visit one of them after the war. I went back, the first time I went back was in 1961, and I wanted to see the town. I wanted to see the Jewish cemetery where my mother and all my grandparents were buried. And I went to see this, used to be a neighbor of ours that I went to school with. And he was very cold, And I knew he was I think he was a flyer in the Luftwaffe or something. He became a flyer in the Luftwaffe. And I guess he was bitter that they lost the war.
So he was cold to you?
He was very cold, yes. I didn't spend much time with him. I found out a couple of years later he had some kind of bad illness from the war, and he passed away. And I remember his sister, one of his older sisters, worked in the local at the city hall. But she was quite helpful when we asked her to get up some papers from land that we tried to sell, and the house that we had, and try to get some land back, or try to make up for stuff that my father had to sell at a ridiculous price. But she was very helpful, in fact. And she had another older sister that is on one of the pictures that we took in one of the services we had with the Protestant and the Catholic and the Jewish people at the Protestant church, where a rabbi came from a nearby Air Force base, American Air Force base. He came and helped conduct the services in Hebrew, and the Catholic had a share, and so did. And these teachers, they all organized the services.
This was recently.
That was 1989, yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
While all these things were going on, what communication did you have with your family?
Well, like I said, I left the town and went to work somewhere else, but I used to come home every opportunity I had, sometimes on a Jewish holiday, and sometimes I'd take a vacation, and they had to give you a vacation once a year. And everybody was hoping that it would go away. And that was a false hope. You see, my father was a veteran of World War I. He was in the German occupation of part of the Ukraine in Russia. And he didn't, even after the armistice, he didn't come home till several months afterwards. But he thought that as a veteran of the war, and they had an organization, RJF, translated into Reichsbund Jüdischer Frontsoldaten, like the Jewish war veterans, like you have here. And they thought they would have enough influence to quiet things down, but nothing helped. Didn't help him any.
So he never had any preferential treatment at all?
No,
because of his...
no. Nothing. Like I said, my aunt was a war widow, and they treated her like everybody else.
So things, as you would come back over the years, you would see things getting worse?
Progressively worse, yes. From, like I said, from 1933 till I left, because I left out of Luxembourg in 1938. Even in Luxembourg, they had German propaganda, and they had Nazis there, but they couldn't march openly. They were restricted. In Luxembourg later on, they marched in, and when the war broke out, they were too small to put up any kind of resistance.
Now, various members of your family decided to flee.
Yes.
Who was the first one to do that?
The first one left Germany when there was the one that went to Israel.
Your brother?
Yeah.
Okay. Were there aunts or uncles that went before him?
Oh yeah, my uncle left one night. He didn't tell anybody. You know, in Germany you're supposed to let the officials know that when you change addresses, when you move from one area to another, not just the post office, but the local authorities. You have to let them know that you're there, you have to let them that you left. And he left by night, and he went to France, where he had a son and a daughter, as I mentioned before, and he stayed in France.
How did he get out of the country if he...
Well, he had a passport, and he got across the border on a train. When you go into France on a train, they won't ask any questions. But he left by night, so the local people wouldn't know that he was gone. He left his house, everything.
He took nothing with him?
Nothing. I imagine he had some money in France prior to that he prepared for this. But the tangible, anything tangible, he couldn't take with him.
Okay. The next person you say was your brother. Was he the first one to come up with the idea of leaving?
Well, like I said, he prepared for work in Israel, and he joined the kibbutz in Israel. And that he prepared for that year and a half or two in Luxembourg, and and then you get some kind of certificate that you worked on a farm for so long, and he, being raised where he wasn't foreign to him like some city slickers, you know, they have a harder time on a farm. But he, you know, we were all used to that. He didn't, work was not, no problem.
Did you all talk amongst yourselves, though,
About leaving? Yes. And my father was not against it. He said, although he said it might blow over, but to be safe, get out. You know, you knew we couldn't make a living. There's no chance because everything was getting worse daily.
Did your father ever think of leaving?
Sure, he wanted to leave, and later when he saw that when we were in America, we got papers for him to, as much as we could, to, you had to put up an affidavit for him to immigrate, and they had to go under a German quota. And when he applied for it, his quota number was so high that he was never called to the American consulate to leave. And when his number would come up, it was too late. The war had already broken out. They wouldn't let anybody leave. See, after 1939, not too many of them got out.
So you fled to Luxembourg.
Yeah.
What led up to that? What preparations did you make?
Very few preparations. I just let my brother in Luxembourg know that he could expect me any day. I didn't know when, but I was preparing to leave. And I had nothing to hold me back in Germany, so I just packed up my suitcase and went to Luxembourg. I stayed with him where he worked for a couple of days until I got a job on a farm as I was milking cows for a living.
Had there been any specific event that caused you to say, that's it, I'm leaving?
No, I think it was the situation in general that I saw the business fading away, and people were afraid to buy from you. You had to deliver things at night. What kind of business is that? You know it's going to go, somebody's going to get caught buying from you, and they make trouble for them. You lose another customer, and pretty soon you have no customers left. And you close your doors. And that's what you see the handwriting on the wall. And you make, you think that there's a better life somewhere else. And I was even, if I couldn't get any papers to come to America, I was thinking about going to South America. But lucky enough, I got my papers to come here in 1938. And I went to, after I got my visa in Antwerp in Belgium, even the American consulate in Belgium, and I don't know how in other places, I've only heard of other places, they turned away a lot of applicants. I guess they didn't, there was sort of maybe there was a moratorium on immigrants or how many they would let in. But I was lucky, I was young and healthy and ambitious, but they told me, you're a butcher, you're a meat cutter. I said, well, I said, I'll go over there, I'll go to school first. I'm not going to look for work. My uncle is going to take care of me till I get some schooling. So I think that saved me.
When did you first step onto American soil?
June the 9th, 1938. I left Le Havre in France on June the 2nd. Took 7 days. Didn't have enough money to take the Queen Mary, so I went on a smaller ship, which took an extra 2 days. And I landed in New York on June the 9th. I stayed with relatives a couple days before I went on to St. Louis, where my uncle and my brothers lived, that had made out the papers for me to come to America.
Now, after you were safely in America, was there still more communication with
Oh
your
yes,
parents?
we had communications with them until a war broke out. But all the letters that we received at the time were opened and censored, so they could write only what they thought it was safe to write.
So what kinds of things were you hearing from them?
Well, they said they were okay, that my 2 sisters were sent away to a Jewish school in Cologne, Germany, so they couldn't attend the local school anymore. They established a Jewish school in Cologne, Germany, where they had a pretty good-sized Jewish population. And my brother, by that time he was 13, 14 years old. He went to work at this Jewish institution in a small town near Koblenz. I think it was sort of a rest home for older people. But they were all taken away later on. Everything was, by I think as late as, they stayed there as late as 1942, when all the transports were organized by Eichmann to send them to Poland.
So that's when they were taken away.
Right, 1942. The exact date I'm not aware of, but it was in 1942.
And what happened to them?
Well, they all perished in Auschwitz. When? I don't know. My 2 brothers that were over there, even after the war, as soldiers, the one from Israel in the Palestine Brigade in the British Army, and the one in the American Army, they immediately tried to investigate with the Red Cross, but they couldn't get enough information of any dates, of any survivors, or anything like that.
So you were never able to find out?
So you were never able to find out, no.
So what did you do once you were in St. Louis?
I went to work in St. Louis in a meatpacking plant. And I was there for 5 years, from 1938 to 1943, when I went into the Navy.
You volunteered?
I volunteered, more or less volunteered, was my boss kept trying to get me deferments, because we were supplying the armed forces with beef and pork and things. And I told him I was young and eligible, and a lot of young people had to go into the draft, and he's trying to get me deferments. I said, I'd better not, because I feel, oh, he says, you have a wife and a child. He says, you're crazy. He says, war is hell. And he says, you shouldn't be ashamed of taking a deferment. He says, I'm not ashamed, but I feel like it's time to go into the military. So I rejected the deferment, and when I got to the draft, to the induction center, they asked me, it says, you have a V on your card, which means you're like a volunteer. Why did you volunteer? I says, well, I don't want any more deferments. I had 2 or 3 of them. And he says, well, what kind of service do you want? Well, if I have a choice, I'll take the Navy. That's how I got in the Navy.
Why did you pick the Navy?
I wouldn't have to be in the foxholes and trenches. It would be a cleaner life.
So you didn't necessarily want to go back to Europe?
No. I didn't want to go. No. And I was fortunate in the Navy. I was land-based, and I was cutting meat in the Navy like I was in civilian life. And it was good duty. I was stationed in a camp, a Navy camp near San Francisco, south of San Francisco. And except for a small transfer to Fort Ord, where we were supposed to go with an Army unit to the Philippines, which never came about because by that time it was already 1945, and they figured they wouldn't need us anymore. So we were sent back to this base till I was mustered out.
And you stayed as, you kept cutting meat?
Kept cutting meat. Lots of it.
And after the war?
After the war, I took a job in San Francisco in a meatpacking plant. But since then, my wife's sister and her parents came down here to Southern California. And she kept egging me on to give up my job in San Francisco to come down here. And in San Francisco, Los Angeles was known as a scab town. He says, you have no unions, you have nothing. He says, you'll be back up here before long, my boss tells me. As well, I'll have to take a chance. So, as it worked out, the first year was a little rough, but I managed.
Now, where did you meet your wife?
Met my wife in St. Louis in a, they used to call it a Jewish Y, called YMHA. Young Men's Hebrew Association. And they had it was a large center, and I was taking English lessons there, and the teacher told me that I should get involved with a young group of American men that had sort of a sports type club there. So we were playing softball and we were playing basketball, and this was my introduction into the American youth. They were kids, some of them were still in high school, and I was already working, you know. So it was nice. It was a nice experience, and that's where I met my wife in one of the dances there.
And her name is?
Rosemary. Her maiden name was Hancher. She had an older sister and a brother, and sorry to say, they since passed away.
But she was, none of her family was in
No, but her folks came from large families, and her father was the only one that left from Poland. And as I understand, the whole family was wiped out. He came from a family of 10 children, and none of them made it. He had a few cousins, some in St. Louis and some in New Jersey, but no close relatives here in the States. Neither the father or the mother, and they both came from large families.
Now, you went back to Germany in 1961?
The first time I went back was in 1961. And there was an experience I went with my cousin that lived in France. We drove from there. It was across the German border, maybe less than 100 miles from France, where it's located. And we drove into town. The first thing, we stopped at the Jewish cemetery. And everything seems to be in good shape. And a man comes down the same highway on a motorcycle, and he stopped. And nobody ever goes to the Jewish cemetery. He wanted to find out what's going on. And he recognized my cousin. So, what are you doing here? Well, you remember him? That's Kurt. Oh, yeah, I remember him. Then we got into town, and he met one of his cronies that he used to go to school. He was at least 12 years older than I am. And the first thing the guy apologized is, Walter, what could we do? What could we do? That's it. That's the question. And And when they found out we were in town, everybody gathered around, you know. Same thing happens every time I go there, but I try to avoid, I don't feel comfortable. I go there with mixed emotion. You don't feel comfortable with knowing what happened there, you know. And you, like these teachers organized all these meetings in 1989, and what they did, and I feel an obligation to go as often as I can to let the students in school and young people know what really happened to the Jews in Germany. And these small towns was an important part of our growing up. We had relatives in these towns, and we knew a lot of people, and all these little towns, there isn't a Jew left for hundreds of miles. The only Jews are over there now in the larger cities. The next largest city is Koblenz, and the last time we were there in our meetings, they begged us on Friday night to come to Koblenz so they'd have a minyan. So that's...
Did you go?
I didn't go. I had another appointment. My brother was the one from Israel that I told you who had these studying up on these, what happened to on the history of the Jews in the smaller communities. And he had an interview with a TV in the city of Mainz, so we went there for that interview.
The first time that you went back to your town, did you go back to your old house?
Yeah. The old house had a bakery in it. It was converted, our front room, our living room, and as part of our living quarters were converted into a bakery, and the building that used to be our barn for the cattle and the loft for the hay and all that was part of his, converted into his bakery, where he had his ovens and things. And the guy was very nice. He was very helpful. He invited us in to have a piece of cake, and you know. And my brother, in fact, I remember once we were over there, must have been about 19, maybe 81, 80 or 81. We were over there, and one of my brother's schoolmates, who happened to have a bakery in town, asked us to come in and have a cup of coffee. So we had a cup of coffee, and he asked us, why don't you want to come back to live here anymore? Everything is nice now. You could retire here. So we just laughed at him. Says, you must be joking.
You have how many children?
I have one son.
One son.
One son, he was born in 1942, and he is now a professor at the American University in Washington, D.C.
His name is?
His name is Brian. He's a professor of economics and statistics. And he lives in Reston, Virginia.
And you have grandchildren?
I have two grandchildren, Eric and Laura. Our daughter-in-law's name is Judy, and she is a native Californian, but they settled in Virginia. And the grandchildren were both born in Virginia, and they flew the coop since then also. One of them lives here in California. Eric lives here in Santa Monica, and Laura, the granddaughter, lives in Miami. She's involved in some kind of a music business in Miami. She does quite well.
How has your experience been related to them, and how has that affected them?
We never discussed it very much, except the time when my son took a belated honeymoon to Europe in 1965. And he visited the cousins in France, and they took him to the town in Germany, and my cousin told him more about this history than I ever discussed with him. So when he came back, he was kind of curious to find out more about what happened to us. And also he went to Israel on the same trip, and my brother in Israel, who is quite knowledgeable about these things. He told him a few stories, so since then he's quite interested.
Why did you not tell him?
Well, I told him, but I remember one time he came when he was at UCLA. He was going with a Jewish girl and with a Gentile girl. He couldn't make up his mind which one to prefer. So I said, look, if it's all the same, he says, I would stick to a Jewish girl because did you know my background and my history? And there's always something. There's always a wedding is. I mean, a marriage is hard enough to survive in today's climate without having these differences. And there's always something come up that you always be thrown up to you. And good thing for us, he married a Jewish girl, and a nice one at that. And he's been married for over 30 years.
Are they religious?
They're not religious, but they keep the holidays. They belong to a congregation. In fact, they established a congregation in Reston, Virginia, and they helped organize a congregation, and they're active in it. Yeah.
And you yourself?
What?
And you yourself?
I myself don't now belong to any organized religious group. The only thing I belong to is the Jewish war veterans. I think it's locals, the Post 603 here in the valley. And I'm not too active with that either. I just pay my dues. I go to meetings occasionally. And we belong to a social group that is an auxiliary of the City of Hope to raise funds for the City of Hope.
And are you religious?
No.
Not at all?
No.
Why? What changed?
Well, after I had to leave Germany for Luxembourg, I lived on a farm, and I had to get away from eating kosher. I had to survive on other things. And with all the happenings in Europe that went on in the meantime, I lost interest to it, really. I still go to Seder, and in fact, last year I went to temple on Yom Kippur. I should go to temple on Rosh Hashanah. That's my bar mitzvah day. And I still know the prayers and the Siddur and the brochas. In fact, the last one of our City of Hope meetings on Pesach, I conducted the Seder services. I still know, but I'm not religious.
So you don't have it in your heart?
No.
Is that in any way related to the...
That's related to the things that went on. And also, I don't want to blame my wife, but she was not brought up religious, and she doesn't know anything about it. She never went to any religious school. She doesn't know too much. She knows about all the holidays and everything, but we just don't participate.
Okay. Mr. Forst, considering that this tape will be seen by someone 100 years from now, do you have any closing words that you'd like to...
I would like to say to them that they should look out for hate groups. We have some here in America right now, and I think they should be closely watched and shouldn't be afraid to speak out against them on any level, and to teach young people to have tolerance. That's how I would sum it up.
Thank you, Mr. Forst.
Thank you. Okay, This is my father and stepmother and my half brother and half sisters. It was taken in Kastellaun, Germany in 1934. And my father's name was Jacob, my mother's Rosa and Manfred and Bella and Hannelore, in that rotation. It was taken up in the back of the big barn. This picture was taken in Ingelheim, Germany in 1934, as I was finished my first year of apprenticeship, and we were delivering a meat, and I was breaking in a new apprentice. His name was Herbert Lichtenstein, and he was also a Jewish young man from town Oberwesel in Germany.
So you're on which side, the left or the right?
I'm on the bicycle, on top of the bicycle. This picture was taken in 1936 with my two older brothers. The one in the middle was already living in Luxembourg, and the other one was working in Cologne, Germany. And I was contemplating on moving to Luxembourg at that time, and we just went there for a visit to look over the situation. And shortly after that, I returned and went to Luxembourg to stay.
And their names?
The names, the one in the middle is Fritz, and the oldest one on the right is Ernie. And I'm on the other side, in the funny pants. This is my brother Fritz, and was taken in 1936. He was working on a farm in Luxembourg. And he later immigrated to the United States, and he now lives in Boynton Beach, Florida. This was taken during my hitch in the Navy, and it must have been about 1944. And I'm right next to our chief petty officer who was in charge of the galley. I was a meat cutter in the Navy.
Which one is you now?
I'm next to the chief petty officer in the middle.
So you're second from the left?
Yeah.
And where was this taken?
It was taken in, the base was they call it Tanforan. It was Naval Advanced Base Personnel Depot. That was the official name of it. It was Tanforan, California, just south of San Francisco. Of course, this is me in uniform during my Navy years, but I was only in from October 1943 till January 46, so less than 2.5 years. This is my Uncle Bernard and my Aunt Laura in France, and with their grandchildren. The oldest one is Astrid, was the daughter of their daughter, and the other three are the daughters of their son, which is Nicole, Monique, and Edith.
And their last names?
Their last name is Forst. And Astrid's name was Guggenheim. My cousin was married to a gentleman by the name of Guggenheim.
Where was this taken?
This was taken in Sarreguemines, France, just across the German border. That's where they lived after the war.
In what year?
During the war, they fled to a farm in southern France, and they spent the war years there. And later on, they came back to Sarreguemines, where my cousin was established in a furniture business.
And what year was this taken?
This was taken after the war in 1949. This is my brother Hans in Israel. His name is Shimon. This picture was taken in Eilat, Israel, and his wife Leah and their two oldest daughters, Bila and Irit. And since then they had another one. She was born in 1959. Her name slips my mind right now, but anyway, they had 3 daughters, and they still live in Israel in a suburb of Tel Aviv. This is a very recent picture. It was Seder of 1995. And it's myself, my wife, my brother-in-law Harry Seltzer, and his daughter Eileen. It was at her house in Van Nuys. And we have this, usually every year we go there for Seder.
And your wife's name?
And my wife's name is Rosemary. And sadly to say that her sister, who was Harry's wife, passed away about a year ago. This picture was taken in January 1995 on a cruise to Mexico. This is on one of the ruins of the Aztec ruins in Mexico. I'm on the right. My name is Kurt Forst, and next to me is my granddaughter Laura Forst, and my son and his wife Brian and Judy, and on the far left is my grandson Eric. And the only one missing was my wife. It was too rough for her to take this tour, and we took, the five of us went by ourselves. It's one of the Mayan temples in Yucatan, Mexico.